Hi, I'm Cautex, and I've been asked a lot about the difference between Dreamweaver and Naya and the scenarios under which one would be better than the other. So let's see if we can come up with an answer to that question. If you don't care how I come to that answer, then just skip to the end of the video. But for the rest of you, let's get started. Generally speaking, Dreamweaver will outperform Naya on single target fights. This is because Naya only really provides DPS value from two things, which is Grove Invigoration, which is the mastery buff, and Burrs. Sure, Bonded Hearts does add DPS value, but it's fairly random, and also the main benefit is only provided whenever you use Ancient Aftershock, and it only lasts for 5 seconds. Dreamweaver, on the other hand, gets the majority of its value from three things. Social Butterfly, or a potential third potency conduit, which if you take Social Butterfly would account to a 3% DPS increase with a 50% uptime. Field of Blossoms, which gives you a ground effect which you can stand in during Ancient Aftershock, giving you 15% haste for 18 seconds. And finally, you get an extra 3% damage multiplier from Dream Delver. These three components just simply add up to being worth more than what is provided by Naya. For me personally, Dreamweaver tends to sim around 1.5% better than Naya, and I personally attribute this to the difference between how strong Dream Delver is compared to Bonded Hearts. But a major element of simming Dreamweaver is that it assumes that you're standing in the Field of Blossoms for its entire duration. If you're not doing that because you have to move for mechanics or whatever, even if you get to stay in melee range of the boss, it's still losing value. And eventually, it could lose so much value that it would just simply be better to go Naya rather than Dreamweaver, because Grove Invigoration is a buff and is not contingent on where exactly you are standing. So, what's this breakpoint? How much time would you have to not be in the Blossoms before it would be just simply better to be Naya? Here's how I went about trying to answer that question. The first thing that I needed to do was figure out how much DPS Blossoms provides. Now, this sort of analysis is much better suited for running simulations, rather than deterministic modeling. Part of the reason why it took me so long to make this video was the fact that I initially started out trying to do this deterministically, and well, I failed miserably and eventually gave up and just did it in Sims. So I fired up Raidbots, and I figured I could just simply run a Top Gear simulation with and without Field of Blossoms. However, there was a problem. In Top Gear, Field of Blossoms is linked to the potency conduit below it, so I could not deselect it individually. After doing a bunch of fiddling around, eventually I was able to figure out the syntax of the SimC input, and so I could simply delete the Field of Blossoms selection that way while keeping the potency conduit. Now, because of how I was doing this modification, it was better for me to just run this in a quick sim rather than in Top Gear. So I did that, and I ran these simulations with and without Field of Blossoms, and the sim that had Field of Blossoms did 10,296 DPS, while the one that did not have Field simmed for 9,904 DPS. So the only difference in these two simulations was that one of them had Field of Blossoms and one of them didn't, and that implies that Field of Blossoms would be worth 392 DPS when we get to stand in it 100% of the time. So the next thing to do was simulate myself as Naya with these simulation settings and also the same gear, and then after I did that, it said that Naya was doing 10,109 DPS. And at this point, we've got all the data that we need to try and answer the question of how much time we need to stand in the Field of Blossoms for it to be better than Naya. So it's time for just a little bit of algebra. We can say that our DPS with Field of Blossoms is the same as the value of Field of Blossoms plus our DPS without Field of Blossoms. But because we're interested in seeing what percentage of the time that we get to have Field of Blossoms, we can simply put a multiplier in front of that, so we can say X% times the value of Field of Blossoms. And because we just want to see at what point they're equal, what we can do is we can set all of this equal to the DPS of Naya. From here, it's just some simple algebra manipulations to get X by itself, and so when we do that, it turns out that X is equal to 52.3%. This means that if you're able to stand in Blossoms for just over half of their duration, Dreamweaver will be better than Naya. And on the flip side, that obviously means that if you're not able to stand in Blossoms for at least half of its duration, Naya will be better than Dreamweaver. Now, it's important to understand that this is the uptime over the entire fight, and not for each individual Ancient Aftershock. So, for example, if there was a fight where you only got to use Ancient Aftershock twice, and on the first time you only got to stand in it for like 1 or 2 seconds, and then the second time you got to stand in it 100% of the time, that's still going to be an uptime of a little bit more than 50%. Now, once I had this result, I figured that the differences in how haste scales in AoE versus how mastery scales in AoE might affect the breakpoints. So I ran the 3 setups, which were Naya, Dreamweaver, and then Dreamweaver without Field of Blossoms, with there being 2 targets, then 3, and so on all the way up to 5 targets, and I calculated the breakpoint of how much uptime is needed on fields for it to outperform Naya based on the number of targets present. And it turns out that regardless of the number of targets present, the breakpoint hovered around 50%. So, in conclusion, if you're able to stand in a field of blossoms for at least half of the total possible duration, then it will be better to be Dreamweaver. However, if you're going to get less than half of the possible duration to stand in your blossoms, it's better to go Naya. And this is true regardless of the number of targets that are present. Now, there's one more thing that I want to talk about with Dreamweaver, which is the differences between taking Social Butterfly versus going triple potency, but that's going to be for a future video. In the meantime, tell me why my opinions are dumb, have a hissy fit about my analytical methodology, or give me suggestions for things that you'd like to see me analyze. Lastly, I just want to say thank you for watching this video, and subscribe for more.